Hello, and welcome to another episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
Today, we're going to begin the first of a two-part series of podcasts on the impeachment of the 17th President of the United States, Andrew Johnson. And I think as we're going to be going through this today, you're going to learn a lot about Andrew Johnson as a person, as a president, and also, Chris, about the things that he did that really got the ire of a lot of Republicans in the Senate and the House.
Yes, and I think that as we continue to talk about these fascinating stories, we see parallels into things that are affecting our society today. And one of those being the tension that was between the executive branch as well as the legislative branch, and what individuals within those two branches are willing to do to make sure that they get what they want rather than what the other person wants.
Absolutely. You know, partisanship was alive and well in the 19th century, and it's alive and well in the 21st century. Some things never change. So let's get right into Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson is born on December 29, so he's got a birthday coming up in the year 1808, and he was born in Raleigh, North Carolina. He's going to move to Tennessee, where he is going to serve in the state legislature, and he will be elected to serve in the U.S. House in 1842. And then he's going to come back to Tennessee and serve as governor from 1853 to 1857 before being elected to the United States Senate. Now, of course, the big issue in Johnson's career as a senator, and for many people at that time in 1860, 1861, of course, was the Civil War and secession of the Southern states. And in 1861, Andrew Johnson actually opposes Tennessee's secession from the Union. He is the only senator from a Southern Confederate state to do so. So he becomes something, Chris, I've heard him described as something of a Sasquatch, a very unusual thing, a Southern Democrat who stayed loyal to the Union. Go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think it gives truth by looking at Andrew Johnson's rise to the presidency that really anyone can grow up to become president of the United States. I mean, you look at the 16th president of the United States that everybody knows and everybody understands. They understand Lincoln. They remember the story about Lincoln having very little formal education. But his successor, Andrew Johnson, was the same situation. Born in Raleigh, as you said, in a log cabin. He didn't master the basics of reading and grammar and math until he met his wife. It was his wife that actually taught him how to do those things. And the other thing that comes to this is Lincoln is considered by many to be America's greatest president. And then many consider Andrew Johnson to be one of the worst presidents ever. Well, it's fascinating.
Hard. Yeah, and it's hard. You gotta, in some way, you gotta feel sorry for Andrew Johnson. He's coming in on the heels of a civil war that has divided the nation, the bloodiest, division the nation had ever seen, and trying to put the nation back together, trying to bring the South back in, following Abraham Lincoln. He didn't have much chance of being a very successful president. I mean, it was going to be a struggle one way or the other for Andrew Johnson. But of course, he does get put on the ticket with Republican Abraham Lincoln there in 1864. And of course, the purpose is to sort of try to get some support by balancing out the ticket. You have the National Union ticket with Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson as vice president. And I believe, by the way, Chris, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe these two men didn't actually even meet until Lincoln's inauguration.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, that they were, that Lincoln basically saw Johnson as a guaranteed person that's going to help him not only achieve the presidency, but also to bring some sense of normalcy back to the Union. So I guess desperate times calls for desperate measures, and he didn't really agree with Johnson, but he knew that Johnson could help him, especially in the South, which many people in the South did not approve of what Lincoln was wanting to do, and what he was trying to do, because Lincoln's whole goal was restore the Union, and basically at all costs, that's what I'm going to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think for Lincoln or any other Republicans who backed the idea of Johnson being the vice president, I don't think it ever really crossed their mind that he might actually be, oh, I don't know, president. But of course,
Right.
on April 15, 1865, there at Ford's Theater in D.C., Abraham Lincoln is shot. He dies the next morning. Of course, Johnson was on the hit list as well. I mean, there was a number of people on the hit list that particular night, not just Abraham Lincoln. A guy called George Azarat was actually assigned to kill Andrew Johnson, the vice president, but he got the case of the nerves and went and got drunk instead. So Andrew Johnson was very fortunate in that sense. He's sworn in as vice president. And Chris, going back to something you talked about just a minute ago, or introduced just a minute ago, was that he comes into office and the fight with the Republicans in Congress starts very quickly.
Yeah, Andrew Johnson being a Union man, but his roots are in the South, and some of the things that he immediately begins to say does not register very well to the radical Republicans, as we will call them, that are in Congress. And Johnson, I think, kind of shoots himself in the foot when he comes into this presidency. I mean, we know that Johnson was very arrogant. We know he was very opinionated. And you have to also understand that here's this guy that, was kind of brought in at the last minute, if you will, to serve on the ticket. And then all of a sudden, he rises to the very top and he sees power and this opportunity to establish a legacy for him, because he knew everybody loved Lincoln. Everybody loved Lincoln. And so now that Lincoln has gone, this is his moment to state how he feels the Union should be restored. And one of the things that he says is, going in, that this is a country that's for white men. And he said, and as long as I'm president, it's going to be a government for white men. And he fails to win over support from the radical Republicans. Benjamin Butler, who will become his great nemesis, if you will, during the actual impeachment trial, was wanting to guarantee rights for the freedmen. And they were trying to do that by passing the Reconstruction Acts. They were trying to provide suffrage to freed slaves and preventing Southern rebels from regaining control of the state governments. And Johnson continued to try to block that enforcement. And so what you start seeing is Congress passing laws, Johnson not liking those laws and vetoing those laws. And it becomes this contest over who has superior authority, who has power, whose vision, whose legacy is going to win out. Is it going to be Johnson's, or is it going to be the radical Republicans? And I think that this is happening over and over and over. And then the straw that basically breaks the camel's back, if you will, is in 1867, in that, which I think is just a hilarious story, the Tenure of Office Act that really causes the radical Republicans to say, we've had enough of this guy. We're going to do anything and everything we've got to do to get him out of the presidency.
Yeah, I mean, Johnson at this particular point, he really tried to control Reconstruction while Congress is out on recess. He sort of tries to do it himself. He's offering very lenient conditions for the South to come back into the Union. He's even offering pardons for former Confederates. And this is just, for the radical Republicans, like you said, this is heresy as far as they're concerned. This is really, really bad. And one of the things he wants to do is sort of start getting rid of some of these cabinet officials who were there under Abraham Lincoln. And so he starts trying to get rid of these people and replace them with cabinet members of his own, sort of making his own cabinet, which, is certainly understandable. I mean, you're president, you want the people around you want to have around you. So Congress in 1867, March of 1867, does pass this Tenure of Office Act. And of course, if you know anything about how the legislative process works, the president has to sign these acts that come out of Congress. He, of course, vetoes it, and Congress is able to override his veto. And what the Tenure of Office Act basically did was it limited Johnson's ability to dismiss or to fire cabinet members who had been appointed by the Senate. So that's going to immediately limit Johnson's ability to create a cabinet that he wants. And he's going to be stuck, at least if these Republicans in Congress have anything to say about it, he's going to be stuck with Lincoln's cabinet.
Yeah, and the one person that he does not want to be stuck with, the guy that just really irritates him, is the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. And Stanton is the only member of Johnson's cabinet who basically supported the radical Republicans and their plan for Reconstruction. And Johnson is like, if you're not with me, you're against me. And not that we've heard this before, but he decides that he wants to fire a cabinet member because they don't match with his views and with his particular policies. And so he basically tells Edwin Stanton, his Secretary of War, who had been Lincoln's Secretary of War, he says, you're fired. Mm-hmm. Get out of here, pack up your stuff. I don't want you to be a part of this. And what he does is he appoints General Ulysses S. Grant to be his new Secretary of War. And I think what Johnson is trying to do is he's trying to cause this Tenure of Office Act to be challenged as far as the constitutionality of it. And so Congress comes back, as you said, he was doing all of this while Congress is out. Congress comes back and says, what in the heck have you done? And they become very mad. So what they do is they say, you can't do that. Stanton is going to become the Secretary of War again. And Grant, got to give him credit, he wants nothing to do with this. So he just basically says, I'm out of here. I'm going to get out. And so I think this event will heighten Grant's popularity. And I think it starts to cause Johnson's popularity to go down. And so what begins to happen is Johnson ignores Congress once again. He tells Stanton, he says, you're fired. And so what does Stanton do? He locks himself in the office. Yep. He barricades himself in the office and says, I'm not going to let this president who is deranged tell me that I'm fired. I'm not leaving here until somebody else decides to get rid of me. And so that sets the stage for the radical Republicans not drawing up 1 nor 5, but they draw up, I think 11? Charges of impeachment against this guy. And isn't it interesting that, when you start thinking about some of the charges that they bring against him, the first 8 of the 11 are all about Andrew Johnson and the Tenure of Office Act. That's what the whole first 8 are. But then if you keep looking at some of the other ones, I thought it was interesting that what was one? Oh, it was about Andrew Johnson having some argument with like a general in the army. And so they said that he gave just a very bad conversation with him. And then another of the impeachment charges, I think, said that he gave inflammatory, long and bad speeches.
Yeah, and it's one of those things. I think if you look at the articles, they, like you said, they do get weaker as they go along. There's no doubt about it. And I think what that shows is it was political.
Because that wasn't that last article. I think it was the 11th article, which was like a catch 'em all. Yeah. It was like taking anything and everything and throwing it in a bucket and said, listen, if you don't like number 1, number 2, number 5, or 10, you have to agree with number 11. Because the others are focused on simple issues, but this is like altogether, this guy is not fit for the presidency. And our goal is to get enough people on our side and get him out of here.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a catch-all, and this was very political. Every once in a while, in recent years, we've seen impeachments and people complain about impeachments being political. And it's like, well, this impeachment, which was the first one in American history of a president anyway, was very political. So it goes to the House of Representatives. Of course, the House has to actually impeach the president. They don't remove, but they do impeach. And Republican Thaddeus Stevens, of course, he is there in the House, and he's going to lead the efforts in the House of Representatives to impeach Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson is impeached by the House, surprise, surprise, on February 24, 1868. And it's not even close. There's 126 votes to impeach President Johnson, and there are 47 votes to not impeach President Johnson. So Johnson becomes the first president on February 24, 1868 to be impeached. Of course, immediately following that, the House has to prepare their case to go to the Senate where the trial will be held. And so they appoint an impeachment manager, they appoint a committee, and they take those 11 articles and their managers and their committee, Chris, and they go to the Senate. And on March 5, 1868, that trial, that all important trial to determine whether Johnson would remain in office or not, starts there in the Senate of the United States.
You say something, you said this all important trial. And what's interesting about this all important trial is really that the actual cause for why the president is being tried, I mean, does it really affect the welfare of the nation? I mean, is this something that is really driving the nation that we've got to do this? We've got to handle this because we had just come out of a war. We're dealing with Reconstruction. We're trying to get the Union back, but you've got these two sides who are squabbling with one another, who don't like each other, and they force the Union, which is not united, it's still divided, it's still broken, it's still hurting, to all come together for a trial. And boy, was it a trial. I mean, you've got to understand that the chief prosecutor for the House was General Benjamin Butler, who was also a congressman from Massachusetts. But everybody knows Benjamin Butler because he was known as the Butcher of New Orleans. And I mean, he is just driven to say whatever he's got to say, to do whatever he's got to do to ensure that this trial, if you will, some people would say that it's not a trial, that it's a political circus, but that this trial was going to go in favor of removing Andrew Johnson from the presidency. Now, Johnson's lawyers come back and they basically say, look, the Tenure of Office Act, which is what everybody's fussing about, it's null, it's void, it's a clear violation of the Constitution. And even if it was part of the Constitution, the right method for Stanton to get his job back is to sue Andrew Johnson. Take it to the court. Don't take it to a political body, but take it to the court and let the court make the decision as to what is happening. So the trial really isn't fair. The radical Republicans want to get him out of the White House on any grounds, whether it's real, whether it's imagined. And the reason is because they didn't like the guy. They didn't like his policies. Some of the evidence that Johnson tried to bring into the trial, by the way, he didn't attend, but some of that evidence that they tried to bring in was ignored. It was refused. Most of the senators, even before the trial, had already said how they were going to vote. Now, Ray, there were 27 states in the Union at this time. And that meant that if we do the math, that there's 54 members of the Senate. You have to have 2/3 majority for conviction. So therefore, you got to have 36 votes. Right. So in order for Johnson to be convicted and to be removed from office, you got to have 36 votes. 12 of the members of the Senate were Democrats. So we know how they're going to vote. They're not going to vote to get rid of Andrew Johnson. That's not going to happen. So you got 42 Republicans. We got to remember 36 is required to get rid of him, to convict him. So that means the Republicans could only lose 6 votes. And the Republicans did their surveys and their tallies, and they were talking and trying to figure out, and they were pretty confident that Andrew Johnson was going to get the boot and he was going to be convicted. And even though they were confident, they didn't stop making sure that they kept their people in line, if you will, that they continued to say, hey, remember, you're a Republican, you're one of us, don't go against us, don't switch your vote, do everything that's needing to happen. I mean, they even had Stanton, who was barricaded in his office. They still have Stanton making sure that generals and army and other people are kind of around just to make sure that, hey, remember what your duty is, your duty. So, Ray, we don't want to get too far into how the impeachment ends because that's for next episode. But I think we can talk about what does happen to Johnson after this vote.
Yeah, well, I mean, not to, well, I guess I was about to say no spoiler alert here, but I guess most people probably already know he does remain in office. And I think after his impeachment, he's a much more subdued president in many ways. I guess you could say he learned his lesson a little bit. But he's going to be a much more subdued Andrew Johnson after this than he was at first. And of course, he doesn't have long left in office by this particular point in time anyway. So,
but peace also comes about too. That's I think the other thing that happens is, they have this big fight and it's really bad. But once again, the welfare of the nation does still move in the direction of trying to bring about peace.
Yeah.
Things kind of calm down a little bit. So, it is a monumental moment in history, but outside of Washington, D.C., things are still trying to progress. And Stanton does leave his office.
Yeah, and I think you see that even today. With a lot of times you see controversy in Washington, D.C. within the Beltline, as they say, but, outside of that, life goes on. It's all about putting a roof over your head and food on the table. And that's what takes priority for most people, not what's going on in the Beltway.
Isn't it interesting? Let's say, was it 3 presidents from the state of North Carolina? Isn't that right?
Yeah.
Isn't it interesting when we start looking at those 3 presidents? Well, we know we got Johnson, and then we've got Polk,
mm-hmm.
and then the third one is Jackson, right?
Right.
Isn't it interesting just to do a quick survey on the presidents from North Carolina and what interesting lives they lived both inside the presidency and outside?
Maybe a good topic for a podcast, Chris.
I agree. Hey, I can't wait for part 2 of this, because this story of Andrew Johnson and the impeachment is just getting started.
That's right. It's just getting going, and we'll be covering what came after where we finished there today. If that made any sense, we'll cover the rest of the story next time. We hope you join us then. If you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can always contact us on Twitter or by email, historyoushouldknow@gmail.com. That's history, the letter U should know, @gmail.com. We look forward to talking to you again very soon. See you next week.